All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenience, truth telling, and myth busting. And it's another of our All Things Canada edition. And my guest is Alex Tyrell. He is the leader of the Provincial Green Party of Quebec. He's also a journalist and part of Global Green News, though don't confuse it with the Global Greens as an organization, because that's separate. And he's an all-round people power activist person. And in the hour or so I have him, we'll be discussing Quebec local politics, green politics, the best way to advance in the eco-socialist, eco-justice world agenda. And we're also going to talk to Alex about his recent trip to China, what we can learn from China and vice versa. And don't forget, folks, to donate to One Plus One and generously, if you can, like, subscribe, share widely, and tell others as well. Help us overcome the far right algorithms and the corporate Western state media rigged algorithms to help us get an equal footing and wider audience. So, so let's get underway. Firstly, Alex, thank you so much for coming on the program, and a huge welcome and a huge welcome to being on One Plus One.
Yes, thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, it's a real honor to have you. And my first question I wanted to ask you, Alex, is is the following. So you are an environmentalist. You're an eco-socialist. You're a champion of eco-justice. So let me ask you this: Pierre Poilievre in the Conservative Party of Canada ran countless times the moment he became leader of the official opposition and fake opposition to the Trudeau Liberals. The Conservatives kept demanding and would always be demanding for repealing the carbon tax. And like the mining industry of Australia, the center right to far right politicians they fund, their slogan and campaign ran on axing the tax. Trudeau, when he was ousted from his own party, and Mark Carney was chosen by Liberal Party members and the oligarchs who fund that party and the media, notably the CBC, CTV, and Global TV, the first thing he did, even before calling a general election, was scrapping the carbon tax. Now, I'm not trying to discourage people from now. I think we should be discouraging people from stopping to use cars. I am for degrowth. I do think we need to keep fossil fuels and other pollutants in the ground. And I do think that the biggest climate offenders should be made to clean the mess they started, especially big tobacco. They lied for decades about what their economic activities we're doing and harming the planet all of us who inhabit. But soft and even radical environmentalists are obsessed with the idea of taxing the consumers and big business. And as someone who does unfortunately smoke cigarettes, consume booze, Red Bull, and so forth, and I can also be quite the junk food consumer and meat consumer. For me, I find raising the prices on these products, I find it's a very punitive way to get folks to end these bad habits. And a lot of times, the response is, well, you know, raising the prices. Well, YOLO, you only live once. I'm still going to continue to live the way I do. And a lot of people criticize carbon taxes as being a very regressive tax like VAT or GST. And we saw, Macron in France trying to introduce a high tax on, I believe it was, diesel or a certain kind of petrol during a time of endless austerity that the French government was pursuing. So, so my question to you is, what's your eco assessment of the liberal carbon tax? Was it right to repeal it, and is there a better alternative eco solution in trying to shift society off fossil fuel consumption, and even if it doesn't end, the climate crisis, that we can see the Earth's lungs getting more healthy and getting the planet a few more decades, hopefully centuries, of us living on it. I'm curious for
Yeah.
perspective.
Okay, well, a lot of good questions in there. On the issue of the carbon tax, I think that it was a positive thing that the Liberals had implemented a carbon tax,
Okay.
although I don't think that the amount, the taxation rate was enough to make a serious change in people's habits. And I think also that it wasn't, tailored to income level or to people's ability to reduce their emissions. So at least the Green Party of Quebec's carbon tax plan takes those factors into account.
Okay.
So somebody living, let's say, in a rural community with three kids that has no access to public transport would have a very large exemption for the carbon tax, and it would be given directly at the pump. So that kind of thing is important, right? Because when you apply the same tax to everybody, well, it hits the rural people who have no options much harder than the people in the city who maybe are already taking public transport. So I think that it was weak in that sense. But the Conservative Party had this opposition campaign of axe the tax and this kind of thing,
Yeah.
making it sound like, getting rid of the carbon tax would make a huge impact on people's budgets, when in reality, they were already getting this carbon tax back through the carbon rebate. So it wasn't really a well thought out policy that Conservatives had. And even in one of the previous elections with Aaron O'Toole as the leader, they'd even reversed their opposition to the carbon tax. So it's an example of how, when it comes to climate policy and many other issues in Canada, that there's vigorous debate between various centrist positions, right? And we debated so much this tax that was just a few pennies per liter of gas, and made it into being like it's basically the only climate policy the Liberals had. And now they've abolished it altogether. So I think that abolishing the tax was a step backwards, and it shows that the Liberals have given in to pressure from the Conservatives, and that I guess that's one of the ways they got to power, was imitating a bunch of conservative policies like that one.
Follow-up question is, it was interesting. This is actually another topic for another day, but I actually did want to bring this up because I thought this was quite interesting. When Donald Trump was illegally threatening to annex your country to make it one large 51st state, I actually thought it was interesting the response of the conservatives, because I think the conservatives would have gone along greatly with Donald Trump if Pierre Poilievre had become prime minister, because I think they are very much kindred spirits on a lot of on a lot of things. They certainly appeal to the more far right, of their base. And I thought it was interesting when Pierre Poilievre was responding to Donald Trump's annexation of threats. He was saying, "Well, look, come use our tar sands, and we'll give you very cheap oil in response. Let's lower the taxes on all of our fossil fuel companies and let's subsidize them more. And this is going to be a win-win situation for your work for your working class, my working class, your big business, my big business, and so forth." And is it safe to say that the Liberal Party has more or less adopted like that, while saying a few bullshit like, "Oh, don't worry, like we're going to be subsidizing green technology and we're going to give incentives to big business that invest in green technology and stuff like that." Like, is that like the Liberal Party's uh green position now, or what?
Yeah. Well, I think on that whole issue of relationship with the United States, the Liberals are inconsistent. At one point during the campaign, Mark Carney said that like we'll never go back to the same relationship that we had with the United States. Well, a statement like that requires follow-up, right? And instead of following up and sort of severing certain ties with the United States, now, once he's elected, he's going down there and looking to deepen ties with the United States in terms of military and economic and all this sort of thing. So, especially giving in on the military front, I think is a huge mistake. I mean, the United States, was threatening to annex us. Can we really afford to continue buying military equipment that they have a kill switch on, that they can turn off? And I'm not saying that the Canadian military should stand up to the United States, even in the case of invasion. We would have absolutely no chance there. The Canadian military has less than 100 tanks. It's not going to defend a country like Canada against an
and
invasion from the
it's
United
also
States, no matter what.
and it's also so deeply integrated with the United States. The United States trains a lot of Canada's soldiers. A lot of Canada's soldiers even act as mercenaries sometimes,
Yeah.
not only for the U.S. Army, like what they did in Vietnam, what they did in Iraq, but even I mean, we're not going to be talking about Israel today, but even Israel, we've had like Canadian soldiers and others like going off to fight alongside Israel in its genocidal, you know, final solution against the indigenous Palestinian people.
Yeah.
So the idea of
Exactly.
yeah,
The Canadian military is not even capable of fighting a war on its own. It's only used as a patchwork to assist US-led invasions around the world. So, from my point of view, the Canadian military is completely useless. It will not defend us against an invasion from either the United States or Russia or anywhere else, right? Even if we put 20 years of the economy like into building the Canadian military, we would still not be able to hold off either one of those powers, which we have borders with both. So the military is completely useless, and we shouldn't be investing anything in there. So to hear Mark Carney now say, "Well, we're going to, further defense, our war, manufacturing with the United States and that kind of thing," I think is hugely problematic. And it's not just because Trump says, "Hey, let's make a deal," that you have to give away even more of Canadian sovereignty, which is going to make it even more difficult for us to resist annexation in the years to come. Because I don't think that the issue is going to be off the table anytime soon. And really, since the founding of Canada and the colonies here, there's been talk about integration with the United States. So, now would be the time to live up to what Carney said during the election and not go back to that previous relationship and not follow U.S. foreign policy blindly and not purchase all of our useless military equipment from them. But he doesn't seem to be willing. On the situation with Pierre Poilievre, I think a lot of people didn't trust him to stand up to Trump because he's ideologically so similar. And as you're mentioning, like he might have been willing to give away a huge amount of resources and sovereignty in order to please Donald Trump. So, I mean, I'm a little bit more comfortable that it's Carney that's speaking on behalf of Canadians and towards Trump than Pierre Poilievre, even though they are quite similar, right?
very yeah, exactly, very much so. And very quick question. Now, we all know that you can't be an environmentalist, let alone an eco-socialist, and be supporting any kind of militarism.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
I mean, we long for the days where Greenpeace emphasized the peace part and was much more militant in its anti-nuclear, not just nuclear energy, but nuclear weapons and so forth like that. So when we talk, and there has been a lot of talk in Canada about defending the Arctic, that the military is a necessary evil because we need to defend it from Putin, who wants to annex all of the Arctic and Alaska, Nunavut, and so forth to be part of the Russian Federation, and all sorts of other nonsense. So, but given that the militaries are some of the biggest climate offenders. Most of the wars are all about extracting oil, mining, and so forth. If we were to militarize the Arctic more, wouldn't we basically be wouldn't we be seeing very dramatic scenes of the Arctic basically like melting before our own eyes, and then it's game over for all of us living on Earth as we know it.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, the Arctic, we can't even get drinking water to people up there. There's a community right now in Quebec of 2,000 people that's been without any source of water, drinking or not, for like over a month now. They've had to evacuate the hospital. The Quebec government and Canadian government seem completely incapable of even providing the most basic resources to the people who are living up there. And one of the reasons that they're living up there is to exert Canadian sovereignty over the North, right? So, of course, there's Indigenous traditional land and all that, but it's also important to Canada to have people occupying the land up there. And so To not even be able to support them with drinking water is completely absurd. And to think that the construction of one or two or even a dozen or 40 or 50 military bases in the Arctic is going to protect us from an invasion is completely false because it's a huge piece of land. And even 50 bases up there will not make it bulletproof there. So there's absolutely no reason to invest in that. The way for Canada to protect its sovereignty is through diplomacy and through international law, not through military buildup and preparing for an all-out confrontation, because we have no chance of winning a confrontation like that anyway. It's like we're going to talk about China a little bit later, but people are saying, "Oh yeah, we need to go and challenge Chinese sovereignty over the Strait of Taiwan and this sort of thing." Listen, if Canada gets into an armed conflict with China, okay, it's not going to be Canada that's going to win. There's other countries, whether it's Russia or China or elsewhere, that have huge manufacturing capacity, like way more than we have here in North America or in Europe, and also massive population numbers. So any conflict like that, Canada will not come out ahead. Okay, and even if Canada does come out ahead, it'll come at a tremendous cost. So there's no sense in preparing for this World War III and everything. We need to turn back in the opposite direction. It's not good for humanity. It's not in the country's best interest, and we run the risk of really ruining ourselves in a situation like that.
Exactly, and we're definitely going to return to China later in the conversation, but but actually going back to the and well, it's all related. It's actually all related. But let me change the subject a little bit and ask you this question, which is, I'm curious if you saw the documentary Planet of the Humans, were and the documentary, specifically, claims that a lot of the green renewable solutions like solar panels, electric cars, and if memory serves me well, wind turbines aren't the green solutions, renewable solutions we thought they were, because of the mining that's required to use something such as lithium batteries. We are still harming the planet, and we aren't conserving our and other species' existence. And that many companies are using, a lot of these, green solutions, notably Tesla and SpaceX, Richard Branson, Bill Gates, and also the automobile industry, to engage in greenwashing. So I'm curious your response to that, and if it's true, then what should be our response? Should our response be that we continue a green transition and continue to use this energy because it will give the Earth's lungs a few more decades and hopefully centuries to live? And yeah, I'm curious your response.
Yeah. Well, that's it. I've been very critical of electric cars in the past. One of the first files I got involved with as leader of the party was opposing a mine for rare earth metal in the Temiskaming region of Quebec. And it was a project
Oh,
that
interesting.
was being pushed forward by Toyota, actually, to make batteries for their vehicles, right? So electric cars have some benefits, like for one, like in cities, the smog and all that really goes down when they're used, right? But on the other hand, like those emissions are displaced, right? They're displaced to where the electricity is being generated, and also to the creation of the batteries and the vehicles themselves, which actually consume more fossil fuels to produce than a fossil fuel burning car does. So those are things that
Mm.
can't be just overlooked, right? It's a serious part of the equation, and although there's maybe certain environmental gains, especially locally, that can be achieved through electric vehicles, the technology itself is not a problem-free replacement to the fossil fuel vehicles. And to think that we can just convert all the cars on the road to electric is not a realistic thing in terms of, I mean, it might be possible to do, but the impacts of the environment of the electric vehicles will then start to accumulate, and you'll start to have people that are poisoned, by the mineral extraction that led to this, and you'll have, batteries that are, falling into rivers and stuff like that. There
Yeah.
is problems associated with it. So it's not a magical solution. I did watch that documentary Planet of the Humans from Michael Moore, and I thought that, it did make some good points in there, right? And it is true that, for example, they go on about the issue of biomass, which is essentially burning wood to create electricity. And they show how like 350.org and Bill McKibben had promoted this technology for years and everything. Meanwhile, they show that if you were to cut down every single tree in the United States, it would provide energy for only 1 year. So it's not exactly a sustainable thing.
Yeah.
It's not to say that there isn't a little bit of biomass here and there that's, like sawdust and stuff like that that can't be utilized, through making wood pellets for wood stoves and stuff like that from time to time. But like it's not a something that is going to be widespread, and we can't be cutting down old growth forests to do stuff like that. And it's actually been the case in BC that old growth forests have been cut down to fuel a former coal burning power plant in the UK, that they swapped the coal for biomass, which was coming from old growth forests in BC.
Unbelievable.
And the companies told us that they would only take the twigs and the branches and stuff like that. But the reality is that the reason they don't already take those is because the transportation cost is too much. And so they ended up taking the trunks of the trees anyway and still leaving behind the branches and all that. So
Wow.
there's a lot of greenwashing, that kind of thing. The CBC, the Fifth Estate, did a whole expose on that particular case, if people are interested in looking into it. So we always have to watch out for greenwashing. And the magical solutions are not as magical as a lot of people think. And really, it's more about like reducing the consumption of objects and of energy. So Green Party of Quebec, we've been calling for free public transit, for example, a massive expansion of the network, high-speed trains between all the major Canadian cities. These are ways to change people's habits from the private vehicle altogether to being on a train, preferably electric, without batteries involved. Those are the things that can really bring down the emissions. The problem is that those solutions are kind of anti-capitalist, right? Because the way to generate the most economic activity from transportation is to have people each have their individual private vehicle, one per person, and sit in the traffic and all that and get repairs and new tires and new brakes and insurance. And then if there's an accident that happens, well, it generates even more economic activity because now people have to be hired and paid to repair the accidents.
Yeah.
This whole thing, the car theft, the fact that there's cars that get stolen, that people have to, pay to replace through their insurance premiums, like all of these things generate a huge amount of economic activity, including the fossil fuel extraction, like every step of the way for the private vehicle, like that's where the economic activity is. So if you take that away and you say, okay, now we're going to ride the bus and the train, not forcing people, but just because it's more affordable, it's faster, it's more comfortable, positive incentives like that. Okay, well, the car industry will go down, so capitalism will be affected negatively, and that's the reason that the governments don't want to go to this direction. Not because like they're too stupid to know how to build a train system or anything like that. Like the technologies are all there, and they're feeding this electric vehicle solution as a way to sort of appease people, and they don't mind investing in that because it generates economic activity, and they figure, well, it'll be a way to extend the life of this unsustainable
Exactly.
form of transport.
It's in fact, actually, it's quite incredible. I remember watching a documentary called "Who Killed the Electric Car," and this was still when people actually thought that the electric car was the eco solution to to getting off of fossil fuels and stuff like that. Ralph Nader was even interviewed extensively in this documentary "Who Killed the Electric Car," and "Who Killed the Electric Car" was it was the automobile itself. The automobile industry itself did huge research into electric cars, and they found that they could still make profits doing it, and all sorts of stuff like that. It's just they consciously chose to like, nah, we like our model.
Yeah. Well, it's
Right?
also that the
And in
even
fact,
the
it was the auto industry itself. Like the
yeah.
reason why, like California and much of the United States doesn't have the kind of public transportation that you get in certain European countries, or or in a place like China, is because of the automobile industry knew that if America had allowed public transportation like what you have in New York, and then having that being heavily subsidized or even nationalized, that would have killed the automobiles. So they had to do everything in their power to basically sabotage it. I'm curious your response
Yeah.
to that.
Well, it's all the thing with that documentary, Who Killed the Electric Car, right? That features General Motors in the 1990s, who had put out an experimental electric car, had leased it to people, and then ultimately put an end to the program, refused to sell the vehicles, brought them all back, and then destroyed them all, right? One of the things with that is that those electric vehicles are certainly less profitable for the car makers in the sense that they're less complex, right?
Yeah,
So people don't have to come in for oil changes. They don't even have to have the brakes changed as often because, like with the regenerative braking, it recoups the energy to recharge the battery rather than wearing out the brakes. And you don't have a complicated fuel injection system with, a computerized system with so many things that can go wrong and stuff like that. So it cuts down on like the service cost for an electric vehicle. I mean, excluding maybe replacing the battery, is less than it is for a gas vehicle, right? So for them, it was logical that they would push off this technology, push it back as far as possible until the public would absolutely be demanding that they go to electric vehicles. The other reason that they destroyed all those cars was that California was so impressed with the progress of the electric vehicles at the time in the 90s that they started saying, okay, well, now we want at least 10% or so of all new vehicles sold to be electric. And the car manufacturers said, absolutely not. Like, we're going to continue like with our gas direction, right? And even since then, they made the gas vehicles bigger and bigger, to the point where now the city where I live here in Montreal, almost everybody's driving in an SUV, and people are practically scared to take small vehicles because they're going to be the smallest one on the road in case of an accident. So
uh,
the car industry is pushed, has milked, the people's transportation needs for a long time and has put themselves above government regulation. Like they're basically making the laws. They've been bailed out as well in Canada, right? In the financial crisis, the big automakers all got
yeah.
bailed out. And they continue to, work behind the scenes to obstruct the deployment of mass transit. And so far, they've done pretty well for themselves.
Unbelievable. And that's a perfect segue actually to this question. And yes, folks, it's actually amazing how criminally overlooked the car industry itself is. A lot of people do. I think the green movement itself has done a very good job of, I think, going after the fossil fuel industry itself. The oil companies, and even to a degree the mining companies, but not the automobile industry itself, and certainly not militarism. And I think, but this is also a perfect segue to this question, which is, do you think even if we stopped making and driving cars, both the fossil fuel powered ones or the electric cars, which I think is largely, a greenwashing scam as well. And if we cut down drastically, dramatically, and radically flying airplanes or coal powered trains and the electric ones and abolished all nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in the arms industry entirely, that the planet is still doomed given the way we consume our food, notably meats like cows and chicken, which are found to be even more pollutant and economic and ecologically destructive than the fossil fuel industry itself. And I'll just say, I certainly don't mind, transitioning to a vegan diet in the name of both animal rights and living on the planet. But I sadly think that such a radical shift, all of humanity needs to do it collectively. It could only happen, a transition like that on a generation to generation basis, given some folks really don't like salad. Some of us arguably are by nature carnivores, and it's simply too tall in order to ask. So I'm curious to your response because I know many big green semi NGOs and even the best eco socialists and journalists like Naomi Klein and others have come under fire from environmentalists for continuously overlooking, downplaying, and not properly addressing that inconvenience regarding meat and how
Yeah.
uh, food consumption and the climate destructive ways we consume our foods, including the salads
Right.
and and the vegetarian stuff.
Yeah. So look, the Green Party of Quebec is in favor of reducing meat consumption amongst the population, and we propose a few different ways to get there. For one, making it so that you have to have a vegan option on the menu, and that it has to be one of the most affordable things. Like actually, if you go to a Subway, you might notice that the cheapest meat sandwich is less than the vegetarian option with no meat on a
There
Subway
used to be
sandwich.
we don't have a subway anymore in Brussels, I'm definitely going to keep an eye out for that when I travel to London this summer.
Yeah, that's it. So, I mean, there's a lot of restaurants where it's like that, right? And there's a lot of places where like the vegan option is like just salad and no protein, for example, right? So it's not really sustainable that way. So, all the public institutions, the schools and everything should have that available, and the restaurants should have at least one vegan option that is one of the most affordable things on the menu. And there's a few other policies as well that we put forward for that. But in terms of humans' impact on the environment, like we're definitely in a difficult situation. Humans are the only ones that are dependent on cooked food, right?
Yeah,
Like we evolved this thinking power that we have. Uh, because we were eating cooked food, right? From way back, the cavemen and all that were with fire and cooking food. Okay, so we're the only species on the planet that's dependent on cutting down forests or extracting fossil fuels in order to cook the food that we're eating, right? So that in itself poses certain challenges because the other species all just eat the food and they don't have to cut down the forest to cook it. So the impact of humans is inherently, important and grave on the environment. But it's not to say that certain things can't be done to mitigate
yeah.
climate change. And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, right? There's a lot of easy ways to reduce the emissions. And the diet aspect is part of that, right? Like the even food waste, right? Like if you take the time to produce meat and then let's say it doesn't even get eaten, like that's horrible for the environment, right? And look how many grocery stores and all that are throwing out like 30% of the food that they buy, right? And then people who buy the food at home, they throw out another 30%
Wow,
of it,
wow,
right?
yeah.
So there's a lot of work to do that way to reduce that kind of waste, right? And there's laws that can be put in place, like the grocery store should not be allowed to throw away the food like that, uh, even if it's, slightly past the date or that kind of thing. There should be rules in place that they have to offer it up for free. And of course, the grocery stores, similar to the discussion we had about the impact of cars and capitalism and all that is that the grocery stores are also capitalists, right? And they don't want to give away food for free, right? Like they want people coming in the front door of the store and taking out their credit card and buying food, not going out to the back dumpster and getting it for free. So a lot of them, they lock their dumpster, they close it off, and they destroy the food rather than give it to people who could make use of it, right? So that whole
And
model
do they
of capitalism.
and to the supermarkets? I'm very surprised to hear that because couldn't they easily all I mean given the amount of poverty that we do have globally, and Canada, I know has the kind of homeless, has a homelessness problem. We've seen the cops like evict, homeless communities and stuff like that. But I would have thought that the supermarkets, given so many people who are what we call the working poor, people who are working class, but they're in poverty and stuff like that. So they're dependent on food stamps and charities that the supermarkets would give that. So I'm very shocked to hear that the supermarkets would even destroy their own food and just engage in such waste.
Yeah, exactly. It's surprising to a lot of people, right? But that's a reality of the situation. There is that like a lot of the times they lock up their dumpsters and stuff like that, so people can't get into it. And sure, I'm not saying that they all do this, and I'm not saying that there's none of them that donate to charity and stuff like that. But it's a widespread practice for them to destroy or lock up the food, or to sometimes use like the health regulations to say, oh, well, it's 1 minute past the time. It's got to be thrown out now, rather than maybe giving it away 1 hour before the time is up or something like that, right? It's also, time for the government to play a larger role in food security and food distribution. Like, especially in Canada, you have all this agriculture everywhere, right? But you have no public distribution of food, right? This agriculture is all subsidized, and you have certain fruits and vegetables that are in season particular times of the year where it's much more environmentally friendly to consume, let's say pumpkins like in the fall, or apples in the fall, or potatoes at the end of the
Yeah,
season, broccoli in the middle of the summer. Like there's a lot of different things like that, but there's no public distribution of food. So why is it that the government can, subsidize all this agriculture, but that they can't give out, let's say, to the community like apples and potatoes and stuff like that when it's in season, right? Like that would make a big difference for people's budget, and also getting people in the habit of consuming the stuff when it's in season, rather than having it delivered from California.
exactly. I was just thinking food sovereignty, an idea for that for this supposedly Canadian nationalism that's going on.
Exactly.
And
And there's a lot of technologies that can allow food to be conserved over long periods of time, and things like, storing food in a vacuum with no oxygen. You can really prolong the life of a lot of different foods. So, we should think more about warehousing some of the local food in ideal conditions and distributing it over longer periods of time, so that we can be less dependent on imports and less dependent on fossil fuels to deliver food.
and that's a perfect segue then to this question. And so, when speaking about Quebec environmentalism, I gotta ask you, how do you assess the climate policies and the environmental record of the Bloc Québécois, or the Bloc, Parti Québécois, the CAQ, Coalition Avenue de Quebec, and the Liberal Party of Quebec? And I know up until, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on my history, but I know up until the CAC's rise, was it the BQ and the Liberals that often were ruling provincially in Quebec for much of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s? And yeah, actually answer that before I get into the rest of the question.
Right. Well, in terms of the environmental policies of the other political parties, like it depends whether they're in power or not. Like generally, when the parties are in power, they tend to have bad policies. When they're in opposition, they tend to have like okay policies sometimes. Um, so it's hard to say, right? And it depends on which scale that you're evaluating them on, right? If you're evaluating them from my point of view, they all completely failed and are all doing horrible, right? The other hand, each government has had some positive things that they've done. Like, for example, in Quebec, the CAQ government of François Legault has banned oil drilling and exploration. So I think that's something positive. On the other hand, François Legault is now floating the idea of a pipeline on the north coast of the St. Lawrence because of the situation with the United States. So it's like not very coherent in that sense. The Parti Québécois, when they were in government, they shut down the nuclear power plant, the only one that we had. That was a good thing. But they were also elected on a platform of opposing fracking. But then once they got into power, within 18 months, they were putting $100 million of public money as a gift to the fracking industry to explore Anacostia Island, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So and then in terms of Bloc Québécois, okay, one thing that's interesting with them is now in this election, they've got the spokesperson of Greenpeace who's been elected to the House of Commons as a Bloc Québécois MP for the town of Repentigny, which actually is home to the biggest weapons manufacturer in the province. General Dynamics employs 1,350 people up there making bombs. So it's interesting to have him in the parliament, right? And the Bloc Québécois has never been in power and does not seek power.
Of course.
Therefore, it's easier for them to kind of play nice on the environment, and they've taken up the cause of, Quebec not wanting pipelines and that kind of thing. But then again, they say that they're reflecting what happens in the National Assembly. So if suddenly the Premier of Quebec starts being for a pipeline stuff, the bloc could switch. It's like you never know. They're not that solidly anchored.
I know. In fact, that's one thing which I find both fascinating but also very frustrating about the bloc and when Quebec leftists say that, oh, I'm voting for the bloc. That's our constructive protest vote against the liberals and the conservatives and so forth. But as you mentioned, the bloc can be, is quite a mercenary party. I mean, they're not a left party, but they're not a right party. It's sort of is a big tent. If you believe in Quebec nationalism, if you believe in Quebec independence, yes, can then come vote for us because we're always going to be defending what's in the interest of Quebec. But there's always these very contradictory policies, correct, when it comes to the bloc, and especially if you vote for them federally as opposed to provincially, correct?
Yeah, exactly. It can be different, right? And provincially, the Parti Québécois can change in opposition or in power, and depending on which pipelines are proposed at any given time.
Unbelievable. And now I know you're not. Now I know you're one of the few Quebecers I know that's actually not in favor of Quebec independence,
Yes.
which is another topic for another day. But I do want your eco-socialist assessments of the bloc because, well, actually, you've already answered a lot of the questions, but isn't another problem though when we talk about the bloc, the Quebec bloc, is that well, hasn't the bloc often voted in favor of Canadian fake peacekeeping in Haiti, bloody and grotesque imperialism in Libya, Syria, very much in favor of NATO and Western imperial actions that led to Russia's actions in Ukraine, also in favor of the pivot to Asia, and notably and sickeningly is supportive of Israel's right to settler colonialism and genocide.
Yeah.
So yeah, your response on the Quebec bloc when we talk, when it comes to their foreign policy and whatnot.
Well, it shows that, the Quebec foreign policy is not very different from Canadian, right? So it's another argument as to why Quebec independence is not necessary. Like if the political consensus in Quebec society was to oppose the NATO proxy war in Ukraine and to support Palestine and to stand up to U.S. imperialism and to not go along with the wars in Afghanistan and Libya and Iraq and elsewhere, that would be one thing, right? But you can see that they're very similar, Like for the longest time, Francois Legault refused to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. Like actually, they're setting up like a Quebec office in Tel Aviv at the same time that this whole thing is going on. And even like the left-wing pro-independence party, which is Quebec Solidaire, sure, they stand up for Palestine a bit, but at the same time, they go along 100% with NATO and with the proxy war in Ukraine, and they support that 100%,
And also fake peacekeeping in Haiti, which is actually just Canada exerting imperialism in Haiti under and supporting and basically supporting, ironically, far right forces who eradicate the left, who literally are engaging in politicide. And Quebec Solidaire, like you would think, like anyone who does basic research into Haiti knows that like what kind of a leftist supports these neo-Duvalist forces, which are literally eradicating uh the left movements, the once mighty Funny Lavalas that supported
yeah.
Jean Bertrand Aristide, and and so forth.
Right, that's it. Like the whole Canadian policy towards Haiti is really unfortunate. Canada should not be intervening over there. We can send aid and have refugees come here and that sort of thing, but to get involved in picking sides over there and that sort of thing, I think is a huge problem. And that's it. As you mentioned, the PQ and the Bloc have supported that kind of thing. So, it's unfortunate, right, that this is what the image that Canada is projecting to the world, the actions that Canada is projecting are not in favor of peace, are not in favor of human rights, and are just we're just kind of a puppet of the United States at this point. And it would seem that if Quebec was independent, that it would be basically the same thing, or maybe even worse.
Now, and but that attitude of the that kind of uh I don't know if you want to call it imperial blind spots that a lot of these like Quebec nationalist parties have, but do you think that that Quebec independence that oftentimes it's just used as a ruse to try to get many people to support this hypothetical Quebec Quebec nation, but it's purely just because of the language of France, but that Quebec but that the Quebec nationalists tend are they very much influenced by what France does overseas and by what the European Union does, and so they think, well, we'll be partners in crime to pan European imperialism. We'll do a kind of a footsie with like America when it comes to you know, yeah, NATO and the pivot to Asia, but that overall, when you really scrutinize what these Quebec independence folks are talking about, it's very shallow in the end. Correct?
Yeah, that's it. There isn't the Quebec independence movement has not defined a lot of key things like in their platform, right? And foreign policy and like Quebec's unique voice in the world has not been thoroughly developed by the Quebec nationalist side of things. And honestly, it's the same thing for a lot of different key questions. For what would an independent Quebec be like, right? That have not really been answered. Like the whole project is quite ambiguous and uncertain. And it's also that I guess within the Quebec independence movement, like you have both left and right wing forces. So they don't necessarily agree on what the Quebec as a country should look like or what the values should be. Like for some people, Quebec independence is a way to not have the Canadian Constitution stop us from oppressing minorities and imposing French, Quebecois culture on everybody that lives here. For other people, Quebec independence is like, sort of going towards a communist left-wing state, right? Uh, so they're two very the same way that on the Federalist side, you got people who are more right-wing, you got people like myself, they're more left-wing. But ultimately, because for one, there isn't, clear reasons to separate. There's been a lot of concessions by Canada that have been given to Quebec in terms of language rights and, even the Canadian Constitution, like Quebec government doesn't have to apply it now. They've got the notwithstanding clause where they just have to write in their bill that they're invoking the notwithstanding clause and therefore they can subtract key constitutional rights from different legislation that they pass. And they've used this provision to oppress minorities. They're using it now to stop people who wear the hijab from teaching in elementary and high school and that kind of thing. Like, so they have everything that they need. And like the motivations and the justifications for Quebec independence are less and less credible and real. And it's not to say that Canada is a perfect country or anything. Obviously, Quebec isn't perfect either. But I think that the left particularly has invested far too much time at Quebec Solidaire, like the more popular left-wing party in Quebec, puts Quebec independence up there on their top three priorities if they take office, I think is a complete waste of time because it makes it so that even if the left-wing party wins, they're not going to start like working on a campaign for independence against the rest of Canada, and all of the time and energy and political focus is going to be put into that rather than so you know. Also, you start a country, you got to start a military and everything. Like, there's a lot of effort and expense that has to go into that sort of thing. And so I think that if Quebec did declare its independence, that they would actually bring in more austerity measures, to make up for all of the economic uncertainty and all of the expenses that come with founding a new state. So under those circumstances, like, why leave Canada? Some of the independence people will say, like, well, we can't be complacent in the Canadian petro state and all this, and what Canada's doing to tar sands, we can't be associated with it. Well, if Quebec walks away from Canada, then that's one less progressive voice within the federation to stop that kind of extraction, right? And so I don't think that any of those arguments that they make are very good. And if there's any that are listening now, I'm always open to debate with Quebec independence
We should,
supporters.
yes, we should, we should definitely have that debate. But no, but that's actually very interesting. All the stuff you brought up because I do think just like just like for me, I'm very frustrated when leftists and this even includes NDP supporters or folks who call themselves leftists. I really don't like it when leftists keep doing this counterproductive thing called tactical voting, where people constantly are holding their nose and voting for the liberals, even though they know full well what the Liberal Party is going to do. And I think this whole stupid tactical voting has been not only counterproductive, it's also counter revolutionary. And it's just so stupid it's amazing. And I also find and look, I'm not opposed to the idea of an independent Quebec, but I also find the people who engage in tactical voting or what they feel is a protest vote by voting for the Bloc Québécois to stop a liberal wave or a possible like conservative comeback. I also find that's also a big counter like productive because if we talk about just the issue of Palestine alone, so if we just examine Palestine alone, I think the whole Vote Palestine campaign, which was playing way too much into the hands of like, oh, you Canadian politicians, you're all so wonderful and we're nonpartisan and we really want to appeal to your goodness. Like, give me a break. Like, dude, this is Canada, man, and like this is politics, and like for God's sakes, the liberals and the conservatives have made it very clear they are Zionist parties. Bloc Québécois shockingly has made it very clear they're a Zionist party, and anybody with a thing on their head, and anybody with skin like mine that comes from an Arabic background, Middle Eastern background, West Asian background, they do not have compassion for you, and they see you as a foreigner in Quebec, even if you may speak better French than Mark Carney, Pierre Poilievre, and Jagmeet Singh put together. And I just thought it was shocking that that an organization like Vote Palestine didn't just say, "Look, if you guys really care about Palestine, here are the parties you should vote for." The NDP, because they at least demand an arms ban. They at least talk about like going back to 1967 borders, and the movement behind the NDP. Many of them are very anti-Zionist and are calling for one-state solution, stuff like that. Or the Communist Party of Canada, for all of the reasons, like they're very much BDS, very anti-imperialist, and so forth. And I don't know what was the official position of the Green Party this time around, but I'm going to assume not very good because under Elizabeth May and even under Anthony Paul, despite despite party membership itself supportive of BDS, and the leadership of the Green Party is also completely out of whack and is really no more different from what the Liberal Party. So So again, I like so the Bloc Québécois, I was just quite taken aback at just how much when it comes to foreign policy, again, they're really not that much different from the liberals or the conservatives. It's just when you see them on the debate, Francois Blanchet might say something that seems like anti-status quo. But I think given the fact that he even met with Erwin Kotler and stuff like that, like no, like give Bloc Québécois the chance today, it'll still be the same uh imperial imperial foreign policy, except we'll just call it like Quebec imperialism, correct?
Yeah, that's it. Well, I mean, I think like in this last election, there was no good option to vote for foreign policy. Like maybe the Communist Party where they had candidates, but I've never been less motivated to vote in an election than this one because even the NDP or the Green Party, like they're very compromised. It took the NDP a long time to speak out on what was taking place in Palestine. They still haven't called for sanctions, nor has any party, maybe other than communists.
Yeah,
So that's a huge problem, and like especially in the Green Party, like they use the word genocide that the MP Mike Morris used it, and the party used it on some press releases, but Elizabeth May was never quoted saying it, and she never said it in the House of Commons, right? And even though, okay, Mike Morris is maybe more credible on Palestine, but won't call for sanctions. Like, why not? The party membership has voted for it
yeah,
from years back, from 2016. Okay, and look how much destruction and death Israel has caused since then. Okay, look at the ruling of the International Court of Justice. Look at all of the live stream proof that we see every day of Israel stopping aid from going in, bombing indiscriminately, like killing like children and all this. Like, what more do you need to see, okay, to call for the most basic economic sanctions, right? Sanctions that everybody called for when it came to Russia, for example. It took not even 24 hours there before the invasion, and there was sanctions everywhere, and then every day they're announcing a new sanction and this kind of thing. Like, why the massive double standard, like with Israel? Why is Israel able to do whatever the hell it
yeah.
wants,
It's
okay, and
yeah,
openly make genocidal statements there for members of cabinet and all that, and talk about displacing them and all this? Like, why the hell are they able to get away with that, okay, without even the Green Party or the NDP calling for sanctions? Like, it's absolutely absurd. And even now, like Mark Carney and, they put out a statement there, oh, there's going to be concrete actions. Like, what concrete actions? Another empty box there, another like, oh, we might talk tough, it's completely absurd there, the way that Canadian politicians, media, political parties are completely complacent and actively supporting this genocide. And it's been, very difficult to watch like this whole thing unfold, and these political reactions that are completely disconnected from reality. It's upsetting.
and actually, before but actually before I get to my questions on China, I do actually have to ask this about the Green parties in general. So it's so ironic that in the United States there is a Green Party which is very much eco-socialist and anti-imperialist, and is very consistent about it. It's not for NATO. It's not for the pivot to Asia. And it is shocking that throughout much of Europe, particularly Western Europe, but even the Eastern European Greens are following the lead of the Western European Greens, particularly the Green Party of Germany. It is shocking how how much to the right they are on a lot of things, particularly on economics, militarism, and and stuff like that. And it's sad to see that the Green Party of Canada, especially under the leadership of Elizabeth May, is really trying to model themselves on the Green Party of Germany. And the European Greens, I could not believe that they did an open letter demanding that Dr. Jill Stein not try to buck the two-party system in the U.S., but but like Green Party of like Sweden, Green Party of like Slovenia, Green Party of Germany, of Belgium, of France, and so forth. They're all allowed to like challenge their 2 to 3 or 4 party system, but not Dr. Jill Stein, who is trying to stop 2 genocidal war maniacs, climate criminals on top of that. I'm curious. What was what was what was your response to that? And is there still a Green Party somewhere, somewhere where you think is a very good like left alternative that people should be following? I'm curious your response to that.
Yeah. Well, basically the number one most credible Green Party is the United States with Dr. Jill Stein, like did an excellent job. And those denunciations of her candidacy from the European Green Parties and also from Elizabeth May, I think it
Yeah,
shows how screwed up the Green Party movement is. Okay. And I say this as somebody who's spent 12 years leading a Green Party. Okay. Like there's a lot of people in this movement, okay, who have essentially become what they set out to oppose at the beginning. Right?
yeah,
Like the Green Party was founded on values of peace, of inclusion of diversity, of anti-violence, of ecological sustainability. Yet we've got these huge, figures in the movement, particularly the Green Party of Germany, which was the first one to have success, that has now become complete war hawk, complete, propaganda diffusing like piece of shit there, honestly. And it's the same
yeah.
kind of vision of people thinking that the way to get power is by copying the policies of the governments that are in place and going along with the pro-war message and promoting military spending and that kind of thing is a completely failed strategy. Okay, it's failed
Or
on,
or
on the
or
moral
or
front.
greening the military, as some of them want, as some
Yeah.
of them like proposing.
Yeah.
Like really,
Exactly. So there's been a lot of people that have sold out within the movement, right? And that's the case in the Green Party of Canada. Like in this last election, they made a radical shift to be pro-military. They wanted to increase military spending, meet NATO targets. They reversed their longstanding opposition to the purchase of fighter jets. They went up to the Arctic and made essentially the same announcement as Mark Carney, but they want to build a military base up there. They want to increase troop numbers. They want to give firearms training to young Canadians to resist against an invasion. They talk about arming the population to stand up to United States invasion as if we were Ukrainian, following that kind of model of basically distributing AK-47s to the population and telling them to shoot. Like, it's such an incredible radical shift that they've put in. And they even went as far as to say at one point that any talk in favor of being annexed by the United States should be criminalized as treason. They want to ban Fox News and other TV networks from Canada.
yeah.
Like mass censorship there, like and mass military spending. And it's just incredible that they were sort of able to get away with this and to spin it off as if like it's green to drop bombs and to support Israel and all this kind of thing. It's a complete departure from the founding principles of the movement. And unfortunately, at the moment, it seems that at least when you look at the more prominent leaders of the movement, that selling out is the direction that they've gone. And just to add to this in conclusion, it's that for Elizabeth May, for example, like in this past election, saying, okay, we need to switch like to the pro-militaristic stance to fit the times and to gain votes, right? The thing is, like, they had their worst result in 25 years under a platform like that. They didn't even manage to get a full slate of candidates. In fact, they had less candidates in this election than they did in the previous one, okay, in which they also fell through having the full slate. And so the thing is, like, the grassroots level, people coming into the Green Party, okay, for legitimate, good reasons, okay, like, they don't want to sign up to promote the military spending and new bases and all this kind of garbage, right?
Yeah.
They want to be Green Party candidates because they want to stand for peace. And if the party is not willing to allow people to do that by throwing people like me out and imposing this party line in favor of militarism, well, not as many people are going to sign up to run. And that's exactly what happened. So their shift to become more popular by joining the system and by joining the status quo Okay, completely backfired. And it wasn't even able to rally enough people to run as candidates. So this whole thing needs to be completely changed. The leadership and upper management of the party need to be thrown out. Okay, and we need to bring the thing back to its roots and bring it back to the hands of people who are there for the right reasons. And right now, it's not the
Exactly.
case.
Yeah, exactly. No, I remember when Dimitri Lascaris and when Miriam Haddad were both running for the leadership of the Green Party. I was just starting 1+1, so I was going to lots of like different web events to follow the debates, and of course single events, which was just Dimitri often doing Q&A, or Miriam Haddad often doing Q&A. When it came to a lot of the different debates, particularly when it came to foreign policy, I was just flabbergasted at some of the stuff that some of the Green candidates were saying, particularly when they were talking about things like we need a balanced budget, that we do need to support NATO, that we need to support the pivot to Asia. And one who was a former liberal was literally talking about going to war with China. And I was just shocked, and I just thought to myself, geez, if people are talking about like balanced budget stuff like that, and if people are too afraid of the Green Party going to left, you might as well just join the Liberal Party, because that's literally what the Liberal Party is all about. That still is something which just which shocks me. But apart from the Green Party of the U.S., is there any other Green Party in the West that you think does good eco-socialism at home and anti-imperialism abroad? Out of curiosity,
Yeah, the Green Party of Quebec.
apart from you, of course, like the Green Party of Australia, or any like other like green alternative parties like in Africa or in Asia, or none that you're not too familiar with.
Yeah, there's some good ones, but it is a bit difficult to keep track of, right? Because the leadership often changes and that kind of thing. Like, if you look at the Canadian context, like the Green Party of Saskatchewan is okay. Like the leader did call for sanctions on Israel. She did oppose the federal party's push for more military spending and that kind of thing. So that Naomi Hunter is the leader of that party. I would give
Okay.
them a good score on that, right? And she ran as a federal candidate as well. But that's it. So there is good people like here and there, right? And I don't want to pass judgment on everybody just like that. But when it comes to at least like to Europe, like a lot of those parties like dropped their opposition to NATO. Like previously, they had been for like disbanding NATO and that kind of thing. They dropped their opposition to it. So there's a lot of issues like that.
Yeah, Green Party of the UK is also going through a huge. I think they're basically fighting for the soul of their party. The party I think is is the left alternative to the ghastly, Labour Party and the other right wing parties. But there is a huge like division going on between NATO, pivot to Asia, and even how to even deal with with Israel. And that's actually a perfect segue to China. So now you recently came back from a trip to China. You were part of a delegation whose aim is to better understand China through the Chinese perspective, decolonizing the mind, and so forth. So let me ask you, and again, forgive me for my avalanche of questions regarding your time in China, and that is, what did you learn about China that surprised you the most? What specific negative opinion did you hold of China that completely changed after your tour? And explain to an anti-imperialist audience, a left-wing audience, a left-leaning audience, why whatever legitimate criticisms one might have on China, why China isn't a rival imperialist nation, and why we should regard this large nation with nuclear weapons and special veto powers in the UN not as an enemy that we need to contain possibly, or confront
Yeah.
as some as some
Okay.
critics have.
Okay, all right. So you got a few questions in there. I'll start by explaining my trip to China, right? So in my role in the Green Party of Quebec, I've been involved in denouncing many different types of racism and discrimination, whether it's towards the Muslim community or the Jewish community or the Black community or Anglophones even, and the Chinese community as well, right? Because they are targeted from time to time
Yeah.
by racism through the media and through politics here in Quebec and Canada. And so I had started a series on anti-Chinese racism for my podcast, specifically around a bill that the federal parliament adopted for a foreign agents registry. And essentially, this
Yes.
bill modified the criminal code and made it a life sentence in jail for anybody who's like involved in Canadian politics and that's associated with somebody who's working for a foreign government. Not like being paid by them or not following orders, just associated with. There's a very ambiguous wording to a major change to the criminal code, and it's not enforced yet. They haven't named the commissioner of the Foreign Agents Registry, but this law is on the books. It was adopted unanimously, and it is a big problem. And it's a way to stop the Chinese Canadian community from engaging with federal politics. And of course, Chinese Canadians are Canadian citizens and have the full right to participate in the democracy. So I view this law as something that targets the Chinese community and that removes their democratic rights within Canada. So I'd done that podcast and a few other episodes about the history of anti-Chinese racism within Canada, going all the way back to the 1800s with the head tax, the construction of the Canadian Railroad, and the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned all Chinese immigration beginning in the 1920s.
Yeah.
So after doing that work, I was invited by the Chinese embassy in Ottawa to take part in a tour, a 6-day tour of 3 different Chinese cities,
Oh,
along
wow.
with other members of the media and influencers, artists, that kind of thing. So we were a delegation of about 8 people. And the trip was paid for by the Chinese government. They invited us to meetings at the the foreign ministry in Beijing. We got to talk about all of the different hot button issues between Canada and China, get their perspective on things, find out from their perspective what can be done to improve the relationship between Canada and China. So most of those meetings took place on the first day of the trip, and then after that, they took us to many different companies in the high tech field. We went to some art museums and at one point a really high tech automated port in the city of Qingdao. So it was a very interesting tour, right? And
Interesting.
we got to get a lot of perspectives and sort of get a feel for the country. And at the conclusion of the 6-day tour, I stayed for an additional 8 days traveling on my own in China, specifically in Shanghai and in the Yellow Mountains area, where I went to go and check out the landscape. So that's it. So we learned a lot of different things, right? Obviously, my point of view was relatively favorable to China before going there. Another thing that I had denounced was that the RCMP had come out and accused the 2 Quebec Chinese community centers of being Chinese police stations, claim that they made without any evidence, without any conviction, without any firsthand accounts being shared publicly. So really a completely ridiculous situation that demonized the only Chinese community centers in the province. But all that to say that, a lot of people in Canada have a false opinion of what China stands for, what
Yeah.
life is like over there, and what the relations are with the Canadian government. A lot of people think that, for example, in China, as a Canadian, you'd be subjected to arbitrary arrest, and that for no reason the Chinese government would detain you and hold you and this kind of thing. Okay,
Yeah.
that's not the case. All right, and the people that that the public often points to, or people generally point to for an example of this, is the 2 Michaels, right, that were detained for about 3
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
The thing is, like, these people were involved in spying, you know, and when they returned, one of them sued the Canadian government saying, well, I was a spy and I was detained for 3 years. Now you owe me millions of dollars in compensation. And they've settled this lawsuit. Okay. So Canada saying that the Michaels were innocent, that they were arrested for absolutely no reason, and all this is complete bullshit.
Yeah.
Okay. And the Canadian government website, like their travel advisories, like they say all kinds of stuff like that, you'd be subject to arbitrary detainment in China. Okay. Like, listen, there are thousands of people that go back and forth between Canada and China every day. There's direct flights to multiple cities. Okay. There's a huge Chinese Canadian population, particularly in BC. And like this is not the case. Like anybody can go to the Chinese visa center, apply for a visa to visit China for tourism or for business, be granted the visa, get on a plane and go there, and go down to the marketplace and start making deals and stuff like that, and importing products and having stuff manufactured there and all kinds of things. Completely open country, okay, with sure certain rules that you have to follow. Like for example, there's absolutely no drugs, right? They have absolutely
Yes.
zero
Yeah.
tolerance for that. Like you don't go there with drugs hidden in your bag, type of thing. You have to follow the rules and regulations of the country. Okay, but they're very simple things to follow for the most part. So that's like a false impression that a lot of people have of China. There's also the issue of, the alleged Uyghur genocide, right? And people from Canada often think that, China is oppressing this
Actually, funnily
Muslim.
enough, I was going to that's exactly one of the questions I wanted to ask you,
Okay,
which is
perfect.
what's your response to the charges that China is a settler colonial nation with respect to Tibet, Hong Kong, and that it's institutionally Islamophobic and racist, even culturally and physically genocidal to its Uyghur Muslim people. So I'm curious your response
Right.
to that.
Yeah. So look, China, contrary to a lot of people, what a lot of people think, has been involved in armed conflict for over 45 years. Okay. Cannot say the same thing about Canada. Canada's been all over the world in armed conflicts over that period of time. Okay. So that's one thing. Okay. Also, Canada recognizes currently, as do most countries, they recognize the one China policy, and that's that Taiwan and Tibet are part of China.
Yeah,
Okay. So that's the fact. That's the fact of where things stand. Okay. So it's not colonialism to try and reunite China under the one China policy, right? Um, then with respect to the Uyghurs, like basically what they said at the foreign ministry was that this area is open to tourism. Okay. And they say you're all welcome to go there, not just us, but anyone, okay, who fills out the visa form and goes there is able to visit the area. They say if you go there, you'll see mosques and religious institutions that are open and functioning. Okay, it's not a place where bombs are falling on schools and stuff like that in like it is in Palestine. Okay, and they also say that the population has increased dramatically over the past 20 years. So, like this is very different from what we see in the media, where essentially the U.S. government has pushed this narrative about the genocide of the Muslim minority within China, okay, based on very shaky and non-profound evidence and mostly hearsay,
yeah,
okay? And of course, the United States itself has been involved in killing so many Muslim people all over the world, so they're not exactly a credible voice, like when it comes to that, okay?
yeah,
And like a lot of different countries have struggled also with like Islamic terrorism, right? And jihadists and that sort of thing. And Al Qaeda was involved a little bit in China as well, and there were some attacks over there. Okay, so it's normal that there's a certain amount of response to that kind of thing. They also said that, for example, like United States like will put like people who they suspect of jihad like at Guantanamo Bay, right? So they say that in China, people are given the opportunity to be rehabilitated from that ideology and released. Okay. So doesn't sound like a bad thing to me, in that sense. Could there be certain abuses of certain human rights? Perhaps, right? Like I didn't go there. I didn't do an investigation. Like I can't really tell. And it's worth noting also that I've accused the Canadian government of genocide against Indigenous people, right? I don't
yeah.
pretend to be an expert on the situation, okay, over there, but it seems that the West has greatly exaggerated these claims at the very least, okay, and has certainly instrumentalized them to push an anti-China narrative. The
Yeah,
same way that they have with the foreign interference file, right? They've got
of
all these
course.
little rumors and hearsay about foreign interference, but they don't have any proof. There's no court case that has shown this substantively, and yet they use it as a reason to break down relationships with China and to get the Canadian population to support a confrontational agenda with them. And it's not just like a theoretical thing or anything like that. Like Canada is actively sending ships and military aircraft to challenge Chinese sovereignty over the Strait of Taiwan. Okay, and they're doing so with Canadian journalists from CBC on board who will portray the situation as, oh, look, we're being intercepted by a Chinese aircraft. Look how close they're getting. They're so aggressive and so on. Well, what is Canada doing on the other side of the world, challenging Chinese sovereignty over a piece of land that even Canada recognizes belongs to China, right? Like this is a hugely provocative
Yeah,
operation, right? And I think that if it was the opposite, if it was Chinese planes that were challenging Canadian airspace off of the coast of Vancouver Island or something like that, the Canadians would not be happy about it. And they might not be willing to go to war for it, but they would probably support the Canadian government going and intercepting those planes, and defending Canadian
exactly.
sovereignty in that kind of way. So there's a big double standard. And the problem with all these things is that they build Canadian public opinion support for an armed conflict with China. As I mentioned before, a conflict that we have absolutely no chance of winning. Okay. And so this narrative has to be pushed back. And actually, today there was an interesting piece in The Rover, which is an independent media. They wrote an article in French about the whole Chinese police station situation there in Quebec, and really took a very critical look at what the media reported there and what facts they were basing it
Yeah,
off of, and really took apart the whole file. Um, which is basically those allegations so far completely unsubstantiated. And even like the director of these supposed police stations is actually an elected municipal councillor, and she's suing the RCMP for like putting out this unsubstantiated rumor. So it's gonna be very interesting to see like if that case goes to trial, like, and the RCMP is not able to provide evidence and all that, then the big part of their house of cards is going to come crashing down. And we'll have to see how they and the media will try and spin it and all that. Maybe they'll say, oh, it's a national security secret. We can't say anything. Who knows how it'll be resolved, right? But there's a lot of cracks in the surface in terms of what the Canadian government and media is saying and doing about China. And the more that people are informed about the completely provocative and wrong-headed actions that Canada and Canadian media and government have taken towards China, the better chance we have at, keeping a peaceful relationship and even building on our relationship going forward. Because honestly, there's so much that Canada has to gain from positive relationship with China, right? Like we have a lot of raw materials. They have a massive manufacturing capacity. And of course, we want to have the circular economy. We want to, harvest resources, use them here, consume them here, and dispose of them here, and that sort of thing, right? But who can teach us about that? Well, China, because they've managed to do it for themselves. So we have much more to gain by working with China. Like this idea of blocking them out and that any Chinese technology is spying on us and everything Chinese is bad and all this, like this can get us absolutely nowhere. In fact, what risks happening even is that we get cut off from the latest technology, okay, because we put up these these blockers against China, right, and these trade barriers and that kind of thing. So then
exactly.
they're going to be higher tech than we are, and it's already like that on a number of things. So the
But
entire relationship has to be rethought.
say to those on the left critics of China, that it's a rival capitalist, it's a rival. Well, actually, you already did sort of answer that, but how do but how do we try to push to push stronger against that? Because there are some people, and they're trying to influence indigenous communities to say that China treats its Tibetan and its Uyghur people the way white supremacist Canada has treated you, the indigenous people, or that China is a rival, or with the new Canadian nationalism that's developing in the wake, in response to Donald Trump, you have some people who say things that China is a rival capitalist imperialist to America and Africa. And I'm curious, how do you, uh, yeah, uh, how do you push back against, against those accusations?
Well, China is not invading other countries, right? The way that the United States is, or many other imperial powers invade other countries. It's not the case like with China, right? And it's not to say that there's no problems or internal tensions between, the many different diverse communities that make up China, right? It's a country of 1.4 billion people. So there's bound to be, certain controversial issues, certain adjustments to make, that kind of thing. But look, like this situation does not compare to places like Palestine, right? Like, how is it that the Canadian government, okay, the parliament has adopted unanimously a condemnation of the Uyghur genocide, okay, yet has not done the same thing for Palestine? Like, this makes absolutely no sense,
Exactly.
right? And the other thing, with respect to indigenous people talking about these different issues, the thing is, like, what I would say to some people who are, in that situation, is that like the Canadian government has been a colonial power that has decimated indigenous communities. Like that same power system, right? That same government, that same military, that same institution, okay, is the one who's pushing this anti-China narrative. Okay. So why trust the Canadian government and military's opinion on an international conflict like that when they are the ones that decimated the First Nations here? They're not a credible source. So, people obviously are entitled to their opinions about Tibet and about Hong Kong and Taiwan and all this kind of thing, right? But it's at least worth considering that the Canadian government and Canadian media establishment want you to hate China,
Yeah.
okay? And they've
And
got all kinds of arguments as to why you should, right? But if you look into them, these allegations are mostly unsubstantiated, manipulated, and used to build up animosity, to build consent for an eventual conflict with China.
I also have to add this in defense of China. Canada was part of the British Empire. I'm recently reading my hero, the late John Pilger. And I'm reading a book he did about his home country of Australia. There's a great chapter all about how Australia, being part of the British Empire, literally was at war with countries it had no quarrel with. And he mentions that Australia was involved in the in New Zealand's Maori Wars. He talks, of course, about Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War and stuff like that. But the first country he mentions is the Boxer Rebellion and the Century of Humiliation. And Canada was also involved in that because it was part of the British Empire. So if people really want to talk about colonialism, I think the Chinese have way more grievances and have way more of a case to say, excuse me, you guys have been the ones that like violated us and like introduced like the most like reactionary forms of capitalism and whatnot. And
Yeah. Well, of
Canada
course, like Hong Kong was a former British colony, right? And actually, one of the cities that I visited, Qingdao,
exactly.
is a former German colony.
Exactly, and so and Taiwan, like we were supporting a far right military junta there, just like South Korea, we were supporting a far right military junta there, and Japan, we basically like some war criminals of World War II did did go into the gallows. Others were allowed to flourish, like like the late Shinzo Abe and so forth, whose party still more or less like engages in World War II denialism and so forth. So that is something that people again like really have to think about. But of course, it's heavily suppressed, and even the best of the left doesn't even address that. Now, my second to last question regarding your trip to China is this. Now, China did go through its own neoliberal period where it did allow multinational companies as well as its own companies to engage in whatever China felt needed to that that whatever China felt that it needed to advance its economy, modernize, industrialize, whatever you want to call it. And during that period, from the late 90s up until the early 2000s, there was terrible and very visible air pollution and smog. And but sadly, there still is that image of China, and that China is like other Asian nations like Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan, and South Korea, in which workers are used as cheap and exploited labor with little to no workers' rights, and that China is a climate criminal offender, just like the US, Canada, and Australia. And I'm curious, what's your response to that? And regarding China investing in green technology, green energy, building renewables, producing many electric cars. It's very wonderful high speed transportation. So China is trying to figure out how to deal with the climate crisis while meeting the needs of its very populous country, as you mentioned. And I'm curious, what's your response to that, and what do you say to the eco critics that China is engaging in, greenwashing and whatnot?
Yeah. Well, look, in terms of the air pollution, like they've switched to electric vehicles, pretty quickly. And they've done it not through subsidies, but by like restrictions. Like, for example, if your vehicle is gas, so you have to win a lottery to be able to own a gas vehicle, and then you can only use it in the city certain days of the week, whereas an electric vehicle, anybody can buy one and you can use it 5 days a week, for example.
Oh wow!
Um, so rather than just giving out money like we do to the car companies, right? So that was interesting. So as I mentioned before, like the electric vehicles, like one of the benefits is that within the cities, like the local air pollution goes way down, right? So the whole time I was there, I never really felt any like strong air pollution, right? And it's not to say that it's like that all year. Like I'm sure there are smog days and that sort of thing. But when I was there, I never felt like, oh, this air quality is bad right now. I need a mask or something like that, right? So
Interesting.
that image of like, Beijing filled with smog and stuff like that is not what I experienced while I was there. Then, like, in terms of the environmental impact of the country, like one of the things is that China manufactures stuff that's shipped all over the world, right? So if we're consuming a product here and the emissions to make it were emitted in China, well, it's not only China that's responsible for that, it's also people consuming the products. And, it's not that, to say that, let's say Canada would reduce its emissions by sending all its manufacturing to China, like the emissions are calculated at the planetary level, right? So in terms of the climate, it doesn't matter whether it's being emitted here or there. And, which country's greenhouse gas emissions, stats should that be included in, right? So there's that issue, right? That the manufacturing certainly has an impact, but that consumption is not all by Chinese people, right? It's often by foreigners that are consuming what's produced in China, okay? Then you got the fact that the population is 1.4 billion people. So it's a huge percentage of the entire planet's population that lives there, right? In terms of like certain things, like let's say packaging, like definitely a problem, right? At one point, I bought like a coffee. Okay. And when I was going there, I thought that, maybe they'll have some progressive like policies for like, deposit exchange for coffee cups or stuff like that. I didn't see anything like that, right?
Okay.
People definitely using a lot of packaging. Like at one point, I bought a coffee at a train station, and it was the disposable cup with the disposable grip with a plastic top, okay, just like we have everywhere, right? But then inside a plastic bag,
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
so there's stuff like that. There's a lot of packaging on basically everything you buy, and even stuff that we order here from China often comes like overpacked, and that's definitely an issue that I would hope that they would address like a little bit more quickly. Um, but that's it. And there is like an expanding middle class over there that wants to consume more and more. Like from what I understand, car culture is still increasing, right? They're producing a lot of cars, like they're producing a lot of stuff. There's like high tech like screens everywhere. Like, you know, if you go into the metro in Montreal, you have like some ads on some screens, but they'll be relatively small. Like over there, it's going to be like the whole wall, like the whole down the hallway, everywhere is going to be filled with screens, and you know, some advertising art also like on those screens, interactive art, moving art, and that kind of thing. But there's definitely like an energy consumption like to that, right? And a consumption of creating all those screens and that kind of thing. So like just like any country, like China has work to do like on environment, but they're also able to undertake certain projects a lot more quickly given the fact that it's a planned economy, right? So at one point we were in an industrial park and they were talking to us about how, you know, they've got a worldwide conference about passive houses. So passive houses basically use the minimum amount of energy required by utilizing the sun and the placement of the buildings and the materials, and you know, triple
Oh,
panes for
interesting.
of glass for the windows and all that kind of thing. So they're going like in that direction. It's not necessarily like the building code today is that you have to have everything and be the top rated thing, but they're going more and more in that direction. And they've developed solar panels, for example. They're very efficient at producing solar panels, so efficient that the Canadian government put 100% tariff on Chinese solar panels. Um, you know, same thing for electric cars, right?
Yeah.
And with the electric cars over there, also, it's that like in Canada, or at least in Quebec, like you can't buy a small electric car at this point. All of the models, like the little ones, like the Nissan Leaf or the electric smart car, or even the GM Volt, they discontinued all of those models. So the smallest electric car you can get is like a large sedan or an SUV. Whereas over there, they
Because of
have
and because of sanctions on China, because of its alleged human rights abuses in Tibet, Hong Kong, and Uyghurs, uh, Canadian consumers can't get a Chinese electric car even if they wanted to. Or
Well, I don't think that those reasons were invoked when they put the tariffs on. It's more that Joe Biden had put the 100% tariff on electric vehicles and on solar panels, and Canada immediately followed suit.
okay,
And honestly, it was kind of a stupid move from Canada because we weren't even importing any Chinese cars at the time. Okay, but then China put tariffs on Canadian canola oil, which they did import a lot of, right? So we lost out on that little mini trade war. And also, it shows that, especially with solar panels, that the Canadian government is willing to slow down the energy transition for political reasons.
unbelievable. So, and is it safe to say, when you were talking with your your Chinese tour guides and so forth, is this is it safe to say that there is like a robust green movement in China where the Chinese amongst themselves are having the kind of conversations we're having about, well, geez, well, it's not really environmentally like us mining all this stuff. Well, I don't know. I don't think that science really sells. I don't think electric cars is what's going to get us out of this climate crisis. So, are the Chinese having those sort of those sort of conversations? It's just we don't know about it because A, we don't speak the different dialects that exist in China, and B, we keep reducing China to our own xenophobic, and more broadly anti-Asian stereotypes, and then just throw in the anti-communism nonsense, which even a lot of the left engages in. So we completely miss out that that China is trying to address how to solve the climate crisis, how we can be a constructive partner in solving the climate crisis, but due to xenophobia, due to the anti-communism nonsense that we engage in, and because of this ridiculous new Cold War, we're missing
Yeah.
out. I'm curious
Yeah.
your response on that.
Look, I think China has probably done more to address the climate crisis than Canada, right? like what substantive change has Canada made to consumption habits in response to climate change? Like we just canceled the carbon tax, right? Like we're expanding the extraction from the tar sands, and our building codes are not that forward looking, and like our transit is not in rapid expansion, and we don't have even high speed rail between the most basic cities like Toronto and Montreal. Whereas China's a lot further ahead on a lot of those things. And I didn't go there to meet with activists or people who are openly critical of the government or anything like that. Of course, the tour is organized by the Chinese government itself, right?
Yeah.
But there's definitely like those conversations are taking place in like official places like conventions for engineers and scientists and that sort of thing. I mean, like there's definitely discussion within academia over there and within industry about how to be more and more green, and it is definitely an objective of the Chinese government, right? So I think that when the Chinese government, invokes like, okay, we need to do something for the environment, like they're serious about it. It's not like the Canadian government where they say, oh yeah, yeah, we need to fight climate change. We need to hit, carbon neutrality by 2050 and then do absolutely nothing, or even worse, go in the complete opposite direction in terms of policy, right? Like over there, when they identify like an objective, like for example, changing the cars in the city from gas to electric, like they do it seriously, and not only that, but they do it in a way that the rich don't get like a free pass out, right? Like no matter how much money you have, you cannot buy the right to have the gas vehicle in the city. It's a lottery system and it's not transferable, right? So
Interesting.
like here, it's always like, okay, well, there'll be a carbon tax, but the rich people won't care. They'll just pay the tax. They'll continue to have their big SUV and pollute and this sort of thing. Like over there, it's like a little bit different. Nobody is like above like the system just because they're wealthy. It's not to say that there's no, like there is some capitalism there, right? Like people there, they're working because they want to get paid and they want to move ahead.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
not just like everybody at the same level and that's it. Like there is class differences there. There is an elite, there is poor people, right? Like from what I understand, the poor people are not like homeless, right? They are given a home, but there is people living in relative poverty. Like I didn't necessarily see them that much, but there not everybody there is rich, right? There are people that are struggling to get by, but people have the basics of at least shelter and food, right? Which we can't really say for Canada. I mean, here you have people sleeping in the streets in tent cities and that kind of thing. I guess that's not tolerated in China, right? So it's different. You don't have the option of sleeping in the street. So it is cleaned up a bit in that sense, right? It's hard for me to have a well researched point of view on this after just a 2 week visit. But people seem to have at least the basic standards met. There are people that work hard, right? There's people who work overtime that there's technology companies where they're working 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. Like they want to really advance their stuff. And the people that are working there, they're not like forced to work there. Like they want to work there to advance their career and get more money and to move up the ranks of class ranks within society, right? Just like here.
and
But
no,
yeah.
actually, no. Continue with what you were saying.
So that's it. So there's certain rules that the rich cannot get around, like the car issue, and there is like a minimum standard that people have, right? Whereas here in Canada, like the capitalist system needs homeless people to scare the other people like into working and stuff. I don't want to be homeless, so I'm going to go and work that minimum wage job and everything overtime to just pay 60% of my wage to my landlord and stuff like that, right? Like the homeless population in Canada is an essential tool of the capitalist system to build incentive for people to work and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it was a really really fascinating trip, and I've heard uh from many fellow leftists who go to China, they all describe it as like you have to go there, you have to go on one of these detente sort of groups or one of these delegation groups, and it will completely change your perspective, or a lot of people say to me that even if you are very well informed on China, like do go there. It is necessary, and here's hoping cooler heads will prevail and other greens
Yeah.
or people from across the spectrum do it, because the idea that the idea that people aren't even flirting with the idea of having a war with China or containing China. Guys, read more about the Korean War and how wonderful that was, and get I don't know, get that stupid idea out of your head. And again, you can't be an environmentalist, let alone eco-socialist, and be advocating for war. I think it would be much more productive. I don't know, talk with the Chinese,
Yeah.
think with them. You want to solve the climate crisis? Get your scientists to work with their scientists to, I don't know, save the planet like a neuro person. Correct?
Yeah. Yeah,
Well,
exactly. I think more dialogue and more mutual understanding will serve both sides very well.
exactly. Well, uh, it's the end of the show, but we usually end the program, especially with our first time guest, doing the questionnaire done by Marcel Proust, later the popular French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, and the late great James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. Alex, it's your turn to do this before I let you enjoy the rest of your evening. So here it goes. What is your favorite words? And because you are from Quebec, and because it can be in any language. So if it's French stuff, go right ahead.
I'd say solidarity,
Okay, what's
and
your least
it
favorite?
works in French as well too, actually.
Exactly. Solidarité. Exactly.
Yeah.
So your favorite word
My
is solidarity. Then what's your least favorite word?
war.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, emotionally, or psychologically?
I would say creativity.
Okay, so like the arts and stuff like that, or even like scientists like coming up with like new inventions, or
Just the concept of creativity as it applies to many different fields, right? Like I think yeah, when people can create different things, whether it's written or visual or art or anything, creativity is very important.
okay, fantastic. Then what turns you off then?
Um, I mean, in what kind of context are we talking? Like
Uh, like, like, what's something that just gets under your skin, or something you go, oh God, like
sellouts.
perfect, perfect response. Then what is your favorite curse word?
Tabarnak.
Oh, I do translate. Do
Oh,
translate
well,
for
it's
our
a
audience.
Quebec. It's like Quebecois swear words. Like a lot of the Quebecois swear words, like calice, the tabernacle, like they're all like religious words, like
Yeah.
from some like Catholic, like cup and stuff like that. But that's the origin of them at least.
Okay. Oh well, funny because I've never heard that expression in in the French from France and Belgium. So that's
Yeah, it's
not fantastic.
Quebecois. Yeah.
Exactly. Then what sound or noise do you love, followed by what sound or noise do you dislike?
Kind of noise. So what do you
Yeah,
mean?
what sound or noise do you love, and then what sound or noise do you dislike?
I like the sound of the birds, and I dislike the sound of like equipment and like digging and like
Yeah.
extracting.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, definitely.
yeah,
And that is very annoying when you are in this city and you hear all that like construction noise.
yeah, and
Then
car noise too. Like, yeah,
that funny. I think that was actually Eve Angler's response to that question as well.
yeah,
And he wrote a brilliant book along with Bianca all about cars. So
yeah. I read it. Yeah, yeah.
fantastic book. Then what profession, if you weren't doing yours, would you love to do?
I'd like to be a teacher. Maybe I will be one day, but I think that teachers have such an important role to play in society for transmitting information and values as well. to future generations. So
And
I
and,
think
and teacher of any age or a specific age?
I think the college age would be the age I'd be most interested in,
Okay.
because people are like young adults. They're still in a formative time, but you're not like babysitting or anything like
Yeah.
that, right? Yeah.
And then what profession? And then what profession would you not want to do under any circumstances?
Uh, I would not want to be like a politician with no values that's got a seat in the parliament but's taking his orders from evil forces and lurking
Yeah.
in back rooms and stuff like that. Like I think that would be the job that I would hate doing the most. So it's one of the reasons I've stuck to such ideological politics and not compromised to get a job like that, you know.
Exactly. And lastly, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is your vision of the afterlife? And even if you're an atheist, please do answer the question.
Well, I am an atheist, right? So I won't go that far in terms of what I would want God to say to me. But basically, I think that, I feel a sense of responsibility to try and contribute as much as possible to progressive change in Canada and around the world, to try and stand up for peace and for understanding across different divides. So, for me, as much of that as I can accomplish in the time that I have here on, to live, I think that's on my objective, and I don't really spend time thinking about what would be said to me or something like that, you know.
Well, if there is a God, I know he would definitely be saying to somebody like you, blessed are the peacemakers. So,
Thanks, I appreciate that.
alrighty. Well, we were joined on this edition of One Plus One, our All Things Canada edition, our All Things China edition, with my guest Alex Tyrell. He is the leader of the Provincial Green Party of Quebec. He's also a journalist and all-around people power activist. Check out check out Global Greens, where Alex is a journalist there, and I also will put a bunch of relevant links. In fact, Alex, what's that YouTube show that you do plug that?
Oh yeah, that's it. I've got a video podcast called The Eco Mindset, La Mentalité Verte. So it's available on YouTube and also the audio streaming platforms as well. And in terms of Green Party news from Canada and around the world, I manage the website globalgreen.news. So we've done a lot of coverage of the Canadian election and really how the Green Party fell apart and started embracing militarism. So I invite anybody who's interested in the subject to go check that out. And of course, the Green Party Quebec also has a website, PVQ for Parti Vert Quebec.qc.ca. And we've got an election campaign coming up next year. And people can also follow me directly on my Facebook account or on X.
Fantastic, and I'm going to make sure to post a bunch of the relevant links to that and yeah, and if folks in Quebec want to join the Green Party, I'll make sure to put a link to that and others.
Perfect.
All my best, Alex. I hope this will be the first of many conversations we both have on and off the air. And one more thing I have to say to you: thank you so much for standing by Eve Angler, fighting his corner, being one of the few Quebec leftists, Canadian leftists, to mobilize folks to get him out of jail and show him solidarity. It was a tremendous act of compassion and comradeship. What you displayed for Eve Angler, who's been a guest, the guest we've had on most, and he's one of my favorite people. So thanks so much for sticking your neck out for him and fighting his corner when he really needed that. I wish I could have done that, but I'm in Belgium. That's my excuse. The other
Yeah.
Canadians' excuses, and you. But Alex, all my best until then. Keep up the great work, and I look forward to having you come back on. And don't forget, folks, donate to One Plus One and share widely and donate generously. Ciao until then.
See ya.